been able to set world records basically in absence of carbohydrates.
If you burn 4,000 calories a day and you eat 4,000 calories of protein, you are probably under eating.
If my knee hurts, I'm not going to have a good squat workout. I don't care how good my energy is.
Consuming more carbohydrates, those aches and pains appear to be more prevalent.
There's that. There was a study out of, I think, University of Alabama showing that, low carb diet was superior to a low fat diet when it came to actual knee pain.
My dreams seem to be more vivid, and that also happens when I fast.
One thing we know is with higher protein diets, and a carnivore diet is clearly higher protein for most people, calcium absorption increases dramatically within the gut.
How much salt do you consume? And has your salt intake gone up by eating only meat?
You're listening to the Primal Shift podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kummer, and my goal is to help you achieve optimal health by bridging the gap between ancestral living and the demands of modern society. Get ready to unlock the transformative power of nature as the ultimate biohack, revolutionizing your health and reconnecting you with your primal self.
This episode of the Primal Shift podcast is brought to you by MK Supplements. Are you looking to boost your energy, enhance your overall well-being, and tap into the primal power of nature? Discover the secret our ancestors knew with MK Supplements freeze-dried beef organ capsules. Packed with essential vitamins and minerals, these supplements are sourced from the highest quality beef organs. They're the perfect way to nourish your body just as nature intended. Whether you're powering through a busy day or pushing your limits in the gym, MK Supplements offers the natural nutrient-rich boost you need. And here is something to get excited about. Use code PRIMALSHIFT at checkout for an exclusive 15% off on your first purchase. Learn more at shop.michaelkummer.com or check out the show notes. All right, well, thanks so much, Shawn, for making the time. I'm super psyched to have you on the show. I've been following you for a while. I find especially your Instagram, both entertaining as well as very educational. And I understand that you are one of the few carnivores out there that have been doing that for several years, successfully so. You seem to be thriving and performing optimally, both mentally as well as physically. And so I'd like to talk about some of the misconceptions that I've come across and some of the experiences that I've made by consuming predominantly only meat in the context of physical performance and recovery. Specifically, different exercise modalities. I usually do CrossFit. I've done some endurance work in the past when I was younger. I used to be a sprinter. I did it professionally for a couple of years. And so, I've heard of different things. I've seen you perform, especially in the realm of strength training and rowing. You have a very impressive, I think, still a world record on the rowing ergo, right? And I've seen a couple of those clips and I was very impressed by that. So maybe to start it off, let me ask you, do you consume any carbs at all, or is it strictly protein and fat?
Like currently right now, I'm eating literally nothing but red meat. This is the whole month, and I'm it's now February 1st, and I often do it. But from time to time, I will include some dairy products. That might be in a form of like a Greek yogurt or a piece of cheese, which will have a small amount of carbohydrate there. Right. Of course, eggs have a tiny amount of carbohydrate, but not any substantial carbohydrates. I'm not eating bread and rice and pasta or anything like that. It's pretty much all animal products, and any carbs I consume will be kind of incidental. It's going to be a very small amount at most. So yeah.
Right. So nothing that would really fuel you in any shape or form. All right. So second question, and do you think there is a requirement for consuming carbs in the context of optimal physical recovery and performance for humans?
Well, obviously there are people that certainly perform better when on carbohydrates. And I think it's what you're adapted to in a way. I think if you are used to using carbs for performance, and they are going to enhance your performance. And certainly you cannot deny that they replenish glycogen, which we know. Certainly you cannot deny that they help to maintain, a blood glucose level, which are all, and in fact, some of the recent literature I've seen is shown it's more to do about blood glucose than it is about glycogen. That is to mean that if you crash, and you run out of energy, it's usually because your blood glucose is starting to decline. And right. So carbohydrates can definitely help with that. And it's obviously a quick way to do that. Are they necessary to perform? No. Are they necessary to perform at a high level? I would say it depends on the person, the event, and the sport, to be honest. As you alluded to, I've been able to set world records basically in absence of carbohydrates. For me, and there's specific type of activity. These are short bouts of very, very intense exercise. Obviously, to do a deadlift, what does it take? 3 seconds. So it's not like you're doing, it's not like, maybe not to do the Tour de France or to run a marathon or things like that. So I think it depends on the sport and the athlete. And I know you mentioned CrossFit, and I think CrossFit can be challenging at the highest levels due to the number of workouts you might have to do. If you're doing 3 or 4 WODs a day, you're going to have a hard time refueling that with just meat, I think. But it's not that you couldn't do it. It's just going to be more challenging. And as you know, we can replenish our glycogen through gluconeogenesis, lactate reshuttling. I mean, there's multiple sources to sort of do that. Our body has built in those adaptations. When I think about performance advantages it gives me, it's not so much the minute-to-minute fuel partitioning that I think about, because we know that, increasingly we're seeing that higher and higher levels of VO2 max can be obtained via fat oxidation, which before we thought there was a crossover point around 60% VO2 max, and now we're seeing people up around the 90% VO2 max fueling purely on fat. So I think that's occurring, but it takes a while. It might take 6 months for an athlete to adapt to that. And a lot of people that, they go carnivore, they do it for a month. They're like, my workouts are flat. I need carbs, because they, honestly, they do at that point. But the adaptation process, I think for an athlete takes a lot longer. And that's what I've discovered. It took me about 3 months before I started to, see that little upward rise. So I think, as far as are carbs helpful? Sure, they're absolutely helpful. But the point I was trying to make is, for me, particularly as an older athlete, I'm getting close to 60 years of age now and trying to perform at a high level. You got aches and pains, sore backs, sore knees, maybe your energy's lagging. Carnivore mitigates that for me to the point that I don't feel sore. So when I go in there and, do a hard workout, I recover pretty well. I don't feel sore, and I'm able to do it again the next day and the next day and the next day. And so you have this cumulative effect, whereas I can get a lot of good training sessions whereas on a more carbohydrate-based session, I might be aching a little more. That's my personal experience. I would find that, if my knee hurts, I'm not going to have a good squat workout. I don't care how good my energy is. I'm going to be limited by that inflammatory phase. And so I think it decreases the inflammatory phase, or, maybe some people would argue about oxidative stress, which we know carbohydrate consumption does seem to drive up a little bit. So I think, from a pure energy standpoint, carbohydrates may be more beneficial, but from an overall recovery, how you feel, it may be a net benefit. And if you're, like I said, if you're a young athlete and you don't have any aches and pains and injuries, hey, you can go balls to the wall. It's rocket fuel, the carbohydrates. If you're an older athlete and you got aches and pains, all of a sudden that rocket fuel is causing your knees to hurt. Then it's kind of like, okay, maybe there's a balance point here.
Right. I agree. I'm still a couple of years behind you, but I can definitely feel the difference between, doing CrossFit, even, I don't know when I started, maybe 6 or so years ago, and now. I'm stronger than I ever was. I perform much better than I ever was, but those little aches and pains are, make a difference in terms of, quality of life at the end of the day, or quality of the workout at the end of the day, And so I've noticed that too, that by consuming more carbohydrates, those aches and pains appear to be more prevalent. Whereas when I did only, strict carnivore for, I don't know, maybe 2 months or so. But before that, 3 years of a very low carb, almost zero carb ketogenic diet, which included some stuff that was not only meat, but still, I had significantly fewer aches and pains at that time than I do now. And I think that's a good point. And so you're basically saying that by consuming, or the carbohydrates can impact the level of inflammation you have in your body. And removing carbs reduces inflammation, or at least that's one of the theories.
Yeah, well, and there's some decent literature evidence that backs it up. There was a nice study looking at, and this is kind of a little nerdy, but higher insulin levels. And we know carbohydrates tend to drive insulin secretion up in the body. That's pretty clear. That higher insulin levels impact this cell type called the fibroblast-like synovial site. And what happens when those cells are exposed, and these are the cells that provide the synovial fluid, the joint lubricating fluid, in your knees and elbows and ankles and hips and, to some of your spinal joints. When insulin is high, those cells secrete these inflammatory cytokines, which tend to lead to inflammation, even increase the rate of arthritis. And so, when you lower insulin, and it may be through decreasing carbohydrates or decreasing maybe just overall calories in general, all these things impact insulin in a way. So there's that. There was a study out of, I think, University of Alabama showing that a low-carb diet was superior to a low-carb diet was superior to a low-fat diet when it came to actual knee pain. So we do have some empiric scientific evidence that would support some of these anecdotal observations, because I know a lot of people that will say, hey, I put some sugar back in my diet, and immediately my joints started aching. I used to think, as an orthopedic surgeon years ago, I thought those people were crazy. They come to me telling me when I ate bread, my knee would hurt, and I dismiss them as some crazy person. But it turns out that, of course, like many physicians, we kind of ignore our patients in some ways. They were actually onto something, and I think we're seeing that more and more.
Have you noticed any differences in how you sleep when you remove all carbs? Because there is a lot of anecdotes, at least out there, that by consuming no or very few carbs, that the quality of your sleep might decrease. You wake up more often, you urinate more often. Is that something you've observed at all, or do you know why that could be?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a number of things on there. So there are some studies out there that show very low carbohydrate diets are actually associated with more very deep stage, like stage 4 sleep. So there's some that shows that. There are studies that show that putting carbohydrates at bedtime actually improves overall sleep time. One of the things I notice, with a lot of people is the overall sleep volume goes down a little bit, whereas some people might routinely require 8 or 9 hours to feel good. A lot of people on Carnivore say they feel okay on like 7 or even 6.5 hours, which is, that's about what I get. I usually get about 6.5 hours of sleep. And the thing with urinating in the night is often, I think, related to a protein metabolism. Because if for instance, you're on a carnivore diet and you eat a big steak, 8 p.m. you have a big steak for dinner, your body has to deal with the nitrogen,
Right.
And that nitrogen has to eventually be excreted in the form of urea. Either we breathe it out in water vapor, we sweat it out, or we urinate it out. So if we have a large protein bolus before bedtime, more often than not, 2-3 in the morning, you're going to wake up to have to urinate. And that obviously disrupts your sleep. And so I typically tell people, hey, move that last heavy protein meal quite a bit earlier, because in the daytime, it doesn't matter, because, you can get up and go to the bathroom whenever you want. It's not going to interfere with your sleep, but at night, it has an issue there. So I don't know that it's a low carb, but it might be the higher, just because if you're eating carnivore, you're going to be eating more protein.
Right.
And so I think that's what's happening with sleep. Some people feel really wired on carnivore, particularly when they first go on. They just feel wired. They have a lot of excess energy and they can't get to sleep. I've seen that happen for sure. But in general, and there's of course exceptions to all this, but in general, most people report a general overall improvement in sleep quality. And I think, when we think about why do we sleep, well, there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the things is we're restoring and regenerating tissue. We're dealing with all the oxidative stress that we've accumulated through the day. All our endogenous antioxidant systems are working. We turn over 1% to 2% of our muscle mass every day. So our protein is being incorporated. And the way I look at it is that, one, a decrease in carbohydrates drives down a little bit of the oxidative stress. So you're dealing with less of that. So you have less time required to mitigate that, because there's less oxidative stress you're dealing with.
Right.
And then the other question is, if I'm regenerating muscle tissue and bone or whatever, we're constantly turning over our tissues. It's all made out of animal cells, right? And I look at it like, if I'm building a brick house, I would rather have bricks than straw and mud. And I equate like the vegetable-based food as straw and mud. You've got to rearrange it and put together. Whereas, animal proteins come in the prepackaged right ratios. You're not going to be short on leucine or lysine. Whereas with plants, you may not have enough. If you don't have enough lysine, it doesn't matter how much methionine you have. Right. That one critical thing, because there's a recipe for every protein. And if you're missing one ingredient, you ain't building it, right? So that's kind of how we work with that. So these limiting essential amino acids have to be there in adequate ratios in order to build things.
Right. And I've noticed, because I have, typically only 2 meals a day. So, one is, breakfast whenever, I break my fast. And then the other one is my dinner. And even though we try to eat relatively early dinner, it's usually a fairly big meal. And even if I consume it at, let's say, 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., which is usually the latest that we have dinner, it's so much food that, I have to get up and pee once, as you said, usually, in the second half of the night. And I was wondering, and other people have reported it as well. And then the other thing, I've noticed it by consuming no carbs or very few carbs, my dreams seem to be more vivid. And that also happens when I fast. And I wonder, is that something you've experienced as well, or heard about, or have any explanation about?
Well, I have seen that. I can't say that sometimes I remember dreams. I don't. I mean, like I said, I typically eat my largest meal early in the day. Like my meal that I'll have, it's 8:17 where I'm at this morning. I'll have a meal around 11 a.m., which will be about 2.5 pounds of steak. And then I'll have probably a smaller meal around 6 p.m. As far as, like I said, we see that actually, at least the literature supports that you have decreased REM sleep on low carb. You just have more deep sleep. And so REM sleep is often when we're dreaming. So I'm not sure. It's not something that I've had a lot of interest in because I'm not sure what it means, as far as does it make a difference in your health outcome? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So I can't say. I mean, I've heard varying reports of I've had more vivid dreams or people not commenting on that. So I don't know if I can say there's a consistent pattern there.
Yeah, makes sense. If there is someone that comes to and say, hey, I'm a professional athlete, whatever it might be, what is the best way, or when they want to do carnivore because of, they have inflammation, they have issues, they have maybe, metabolic issues, whatever. Would you recommend they go cold turkey or transition into a pure?
Yeah, no, I would transition into it. I think, again, I'm not anti-carbohydrate. I think if it serves you for a purpose, maybe you've got some gut issue or some autoimmune disease or you're older and you're trying to mitigate inflammation, then I think it makes sense. But I think the way that, I've worked with a lot of high-level professional athletes, I think that what it makes sense to do is find a minimum effective dose of carbohydrate, put it in the peri-workout time, either pre, post, or during, figure out what that minimal amount is. And, there's a professor, Phil Prinz out of he's in Pennsylvania, has done some pretty interesting research on this. And again, around performance. And again, it's not so much glycogen restoration, but it is blood glucose maintenance. And so you can maintain your blood glucose with as little as like 20 grams per hour, which, if you look at like some of these endurance athletes, they're often consuming 100 grams an hour, 60 grams an hour, something quite high. And you might need much less than that. And then what you want to do is, tailor it to the workout. Some workouts don't require it. Some workouts are going to be, with CrossFit, some of them are high intense, metabolic workouts, whereas other ones are going to be more form based or more strength based, where I don't think that extra carbohydrate is necessary in many cases. So you'll figure it out. And then many people are able to, over a period of about 6 months, wean off to a point. And then a lot of them, literally, they feel better without it at times. And so it's kind of one of those balances. So, and then finding the right carbohydrate that doesn't cause gastrointestinal problems is, sometimes challenging for some folks. But that's how I often talk to people, because, doing it in the off season. If your sport has an off season, you can use that time to transition, because trying to do it in the middle of season is going to be challenging, because your performance likely will go down for a period of time, maybe many months, until it starts to rebound and go back up. But once you make the transition, many people find their performance ultimately goes up. And again, there's now research coming out that shows that people on, ketogenic diets, we don't have a lot of carnivore research yet, but we do have some, I think, extrapolatable experience from ketogenic diets that show, actually improve performance over carbohydrate-based diets. There's actually some studies that have come out now that show that.
You mentioned before that, for the past month, you've only consumed meat. So that means no eggs?
That's correct. Yeah, it's every year, World Carnivore Month is every January. I started that 7 years ago because my birthday's in January for no other reason. And I always use that as like a reset. I just kind of eat nothing but steak, beef, salt, and water. And I always feel fantastic. I literally feel like I can run through a wall right now. I mean, I just feel that good. And then inevitably throughout the year, I'll be traveling, and it's hard to get a ribeye steak for breakfast. So I might eat bacon and eggs, and then the eggs will creep back in, and then eventually some, cheese will make it back in there. And I might have a little bit of yogurt here and there. And that, and then next year I'll do it again, probably settle back in there. But it's something that I'm not dogmatic. Occasionally I'll have a piece of birthday cake. I've said that on many occasions. I'm not dogmatic about this, but generally, without exaggeration, my diet is probably, all told throughout the year, is probably 95, 98% just beef, just red meat. And I do really well on that. I'm very happy with that.
Right. Is there, obviously, muscle meat from ruminants is incredibly nutritious. Is there anything, I think the answer is no, because otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. But is there anything that you might be missing out? I don't know, calcium, let's say, that unless you chew the bones, might not be getting?
Yeah, well, calcium, there's a wonderful gal, her name's Amber Ahern. She wrote a really nice paper. I can't remember which journal it was published in, but it talked about the nutritional adequacy of carnivore diet. And, basically she showed that you could get every nutrient that's basically thought about. The only question mark was calcium. And it was like, well, where do you get your calcium from? And it's interesting that one thing we know is with higher protein diets, and a carnivore diet is clearly higher protein for most people, calcium absorption increases dramatically within the gut. We know that. That's originally, there used to be this thing called the acid ash hypothesis. So what we would see is high protein diets, people would have hypercalciuria. They'd have a lot of calcium in their urine. And the assumption was it was being pulled from the bones. It was like high protein leads to bone, calcium being leached from the bone, and that's why it's being released in the urine. Well, that turned out not to be true. They found out that actually it was higher gut absorption. So basically what happens is it just, as we absorb more from our gut, we excrete more out in the urine, so we maintain calcium homeostasis throughout the body. So we know that calcium absorption goes up significantly on a carnivore diet, and there is some calcium in meat, believe it or not. You think about it, every muscle in our body requires calcium, right? We require calcium to contract our muscles. So all those muscles have to have calcium in it by definition. So you're getting some. Also, interestingly, there's a fellow by the name of Walter Willett, who a lot of people in the low-carb carnivore think he's a bad guy, right? He's a plant-based guy. But he's done some compelling research showing that the overall human requirement for calcium, the RDA, is probably overinflated by maybe as much as 3 or 4 times. So our overall calcium requirement may actually be less than what we think it is, particularly as an adult. As a child, we're consuming obviously breast milk, and as a kid we might require more because we're growing our skeleton. But after our skeleton is grown, I mean, you don't need much because you're constantly moving calcium in and out of the different tissues. So it may not be that we need any. I mean, the short answer is I've yet to see someone on carnivore who has exhibited any evidence of calcium deficiency. Right. I mean, I've certainly not seen, low blood calcium. I've never seen that. I've not seen anybody with any significant fracture risk or osteopenia. In fact, we see the reverse. We often see people laying down more bone mineral density. And I think one of the things a lot of people fail to realize is bone is not just calcium. We're not made out of chalk. We have a lot of protein in our bones. Right. And, it's almost 50% of our bones are made out of protein, particularly type 1 collagen. And so that animal products really seems to help foster the bones. I mean, there's been a lot of studies now showing that people on plant-based diets, particularly vegans, are at really high risk for fracture rates. Right. Even if they supplement calcium, probably due to protein, bioavailability issues.
Right. Oh, that makes sense. All right. In terms of salt intake, you mentioned you consume salt with your meat. How much salt do you consume? And has your salt intake gone up by eating only meat?
Well, I don't specifically track. I salt to taste. I throw salt on my steak till I think it tastes good. And I think that's an internal mechanism by which we have. If anytime you oversalt something, your body immediately says, well, that's too salty. And I think that's like we drink when we're thirsty. And I think we have this salt receptor mechanism by which to do that. Has my overall salt consumption gone up since I've been carnivore? I mean, compared to what? I mean, if we look at the average American's diet and we're eating a lot of processed food, there's massive amounts of salt in all this processed food. And I think that's where because there's an association between salt intake and negative health outcomes. But I think it's because we're eating so much salty food, which would be the processed food, which is probably the confounder here. Whereas if I just eat steak, and steak has a small amount of, it does have sodium in it, has chloride in that, as well as potassium. But specifically because I work out a lot, I'm sweating all the time, as you might be in CrossFit, depending on what part of the world you're in. Right. I think I just need a little bit more salt to make that happen. There are people on carnivore diet that eat no salt, which is kind of interesting to me, and they seem to be doing okay. But I think specific because of the fact that I prefer to exercise and sweat a lot, then I have to increase my salt intake somewhat.
Do you think there is some sort of adaptation, or even, I don't want to call it necessarily addiction, but some sort of, feedback loop going on where if you start consuming more salt, you get used to that higher level. And then if you, dial it back to quote unquote normal levels or lower levels, you might have a negative, at least temporarily, a negative impact. And I'm asking this because I've noticed that I think we have increased our salt intake. We use more salt on the foods that we prepare ourselves. But that's probably also, again, because, by cutting out all processed stuff, we cut out all the salt that we got, not even knowing we got it. And now we have to kind of, add back in to make it taste. But I noticed that on days where I consume less salt than I did in the past, I would cramp more easily than on days where I, just actively, let's say have a glass of, element or whatever, some electrolyte shake with my workout.
Yeah, I mean, can you add up to having more saltier food? I do think, I think your taste can kind of add up to a degree. I think that as far as, there is a homeostasis. Our body does seek some level of homeostasis, and you do adapt to it. If you consume more salt, you'll excrete more. I mean, it's just, you're gonna maintain, where the body very diligently defends, blood sodium levels. If it gets below, 135-ish and starts getting in the 120s, you start having signs of hyponatremia, you can get brain swelling and things like that. So there is an adaptation process. And so you can sort of up and down regulate that. If you consume too much, you'll pee more out. If you consume not as much, less. And so there is something that you can kind of do that. But I find that, if I'm working out really hard, like say I've had a hard leg workout, and sometimes I get leg cramps occasionally, but not very often, but usually that occurs when I've either underconsumed enough food or maybe I just don't have enough electrolytes, because we do know pretty clearly that cramps are associated with electrolytes. It's really something that's hard to study, because it's hard to do a study on cramps because they're so unpredictable. It's just can't, assume this person's got a cramp overnight, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. So there's not a lot of data on there. Some that suggest, magnesium has a role in that, which it probably does. But I do think it's possible to get used to more salt or get used to less salt. That is certainly the case. Certainly with sugar. I mean, with sweet, you can do that, because if you go a long period without eating anything sweet, all of a sudden, something that's only mildly sweet now tastes quite sweet to you. Whereas before, in years gone by, I loved eating dessert. I mean, dessert tastes good to me. But I would like the sweet. I would be attracted to the most sweet thing possible. And now I'm like, well, a piece of fruit is plenty sweet for me these days. And not that I ever consume that very much, but yeah, I do think we adapt.
Right. You said, you're not generally against carbs. Do you think there are certain types of carbs that if you consume them, you should rather stay away from, like, fructose, let's say, or, sweet fruits in general? Is there a difference between the type of carbs that you might be more likely to do well with than others?
Well, I think this goes really more to whole foods versus highly processed foods. I mean, I think, a lot of the carbohydrates we consume, breads, pastas, certainly all the baked goods, and, because we are consuming powdered food, and let's be real, a cake is basically just a mixture of powder, sugar and flour and things like that. The surface area has been so broken down. So you have this extremely high surface area of food, and it's so rapidly absorbed in our gut. Whereas a whole, sort of a whole food carbohydrate would be broken down much more slowly. The microbiome would actually consume some of it. And this is what's happening. And, if we look at I think this actually helps to fuel the obesity epidemic, as we've seen over the years that, from the 1950s, 60s, we've seen a significant rise in caloric intake. And then around 2000, it started to level off. I mean, we really haven't consumed much more calories between 2000 and 2024. It's, within a few, not much difference. And yet our obesity rates have skyrocketed because our reliance on these ultra-processed foods and those powdered foods has gone up significantly. And whereas in the past, our gut microbiome can actually consume up to 22% of our calories. And if they're not getting it anymore and it's all being absorbed by us, we're just absorbing more of the food. Even though we're eating the same amount of calories, we're absorbing more of it. Therefore, we're becoming overweight. But as far as, again, from a performance standpoint of an athlete, and again, there's a difference between an athlete and somebody who's sedentary. An athlete who needs that calories, then in that case, you probably want something that's rapidly absorbable. Even things like dextrose tablets, those things are what you really want here as an athlete is sugar. I mean, you want your blood glucose to go up, and that's what, diabetics use. And they use that because it's very rapidly absorbed. It helps them with hypoglycemia. And so something like that may be one of the more ideal things, even though it's basically a hunk of glucose, rather than something that's going to break down more slowly. So it depends on the guess the end goal here. If it's just, I need a little blood glucose bump for my performance. Yeah. If it's like, I like to eat carbs, but I don't want to gain a bunch of weight because, then you probably should, you're better off avoiding the sugary, highly refined processed grains and things like that, particularly when they're coupled with some sort of fat, which makes it even like the donut is the perfect food. I mean, it's the perfect awful food, right?
Right.
Processed grains, sugar, some kind of nasty oil typically. But yeah, those are things I would avoid.
Right. You mentioned before, calories and how calories are being used by the microbiome. Have you seen that athletes going on a meat-based diet underconsume calories or protein more specifically? Because I know that, a lot of the protein and even the fat we consume is not only used for energy, right? It's used for a ton of different metabolic processes. And so you only end up with with a certain amount of those calories that are available for fuel. Now, if you burn 4,000 calories a day and you eat 4,000 calories of protein, you are probably under eating. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think it's very fair to say that it is challenging to eat enough calories on carnivore. That is true. I mean, that's why eating carbohydrates, it makes it easy for you to consume a lot of calories. I think that's one of its greatest benefits. If you look at like other dietary strategies, a friend of mine, Stan Efferding, vertical diet, he deals with a lot of big athletes, world's strongest men, competitors, and stuff like that. And they routinely need to consume, 7, 8, 9, sometimes 10,000 calories a day. It's hard to do that. That's like 10 pounds of meat, which is very challenging to do. I mean, I think the most I've ever eaten in one day was 8 pounds of meat. But I mean, and that was difficult for me. But if I could eat, and like he does, he uses dextrose enhanced rice because it makes him eat more. And we have this, there's these weight loss drugs, these new GLP-1 receptor agonists, so Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, Zepbound, I think is the other one. They all act on this, GLP-1 receptor through this, and these are incretin hormones, glucagon-like peptide, and meat naturally stimulates those things. So meat naturally has this satiety effect. And so a lot of people, particularly people that require a lot of food, struggle to do that. I mean, I routinely eat about 4 pounds a day. That's about, depending on how much fat in there, that's between 3,500 and 4,000 calories. Yeah. And I'm a pretty big person. I'm 6'5", I'm 265 pounds. A lot of people, that sounds like that's a lot of food, 4 pounds of meat, but it's in reality, I need that much. I mean, just to, if you plug my numbers into any dietary, energy calculator, it's going to come out, somewhere around 4,000 calories. And so, and eating 4 pounds of meat a day is, for some people, would be hard. I do it pretty easily, but a lot of people would struggle with that.
And I've noticed the same there are only 2 meals, that I eat per day. And with every meal, I really have to stuff myself to feel like I'm getting enough. And people look at me like, I don't know how you eat that much without gaining weight. I'm like, well, it's mostly fat and protein. And if you do that and don't, make up your calories with carbs, you can easily do that without, the only thing you gain is probably muscle tissue. At least you maintain it, but not any body fat, and I think that's a huge misconception with, people trying to perform on a very high protein diet and they just don't eat enough. And then they wonder why they are not gaining or, potentially even losing, muscle mass.
Yeah, like I said, there is obviously with the fate of protein in the body has a couple fates. It's going to either be incorporated into the structure, turn over muscle mass, bone, organ, skin, whatever, gut lining, all the protein's going to go there. Once it's done that, then, then these amino acids have, they can either become, they're gluconeogenic or ketogenic. And so they, some can do both, but I mean, they're going to either turn into ketones or they're going to turn into glucose. Right. And so if you don't have enough carbohydrates, you're kind of relying on adequate protein. And, and there's been good studies on particularly like endurance athletes, particularly low carb endurance athletes need to eat more protein. That's just been clearly shown because some of that protein is being turned into energy. Now, it's not as efficient as it might be for carbohydrates. And so you're like, well, why don't you just eat carbs? Well, that could be the answer if you tolerate them. But if you're an older guy like me and it gives you inflammation, you're like, well, maybe that's not the best route for me in particular. So, I mean, there's, again, there's pros and cons of both of these things.
Right. Have you seen a difference between male and female athletes? And I'm asking this because a lot of the studies, a lot of the medical advice is really geared towards men. There is significantly less studies and evidence, in the terms of, female health. Have you noticed a difference? Is it, can women just as well do a pure carnivore diet? Should they be doing a pure carnivore diet? Is that consistent with human history and evolution? Or is there a case to be made for women to eat differently?
No, I think women do have some different needs. Obviously, we're very different in many ways. We're alike in most ways, but different in some ways. And I think, around menstrual cycles, I think that women in general, I mean, they carry more body fat. I think they require a higher amount of fat in many cases, and so they might have to eat a higher fat percentage than, say, someone like you or I could eat. I mean, I still eat high fat. I mean, my calories are still probably 65, maybe 70% of my calories are coming from the fat, and the rest is generally protein and the trace amount of carbs I eat. Women might have to skew that a little bit higher. And it may depend upon where they are in their, in their menstrual cycle. So there are some differences I've seen. I mean, those differences also depend on, like, if we're talking about young, healthy people that are athletes, those are the major differences. When we're talking disease states, I see certainly differences in fat requirements for different disease processes. But yeah, I think that women generally have a little bit different energy demands than men do. And I think, sometimes they need a higher percentage of total energy to protein, particularly at certain times of the month.
Right. But that doesn't necessarily mean those sources of energy have to come from carbs, right? It means
no. I think it's just energy. I think in my view, I think carbs and fat are just energy, and you can have your choice. I mean, and I think the literature is fairly clear on that. That whatever you're adapted to, and again, this is because most of the data we have is based on general population data. So we just assume that it's like most of the data we have on heart disease are on sick people. We don't have a lot of healthy population data, and we certainly don't have a lot of data on low carb people. It's just not, most of the data we've ever gathered has been on people that consume 55 to 60% of their calories from carbs and kind of a grain-based population. So we don't really have as much data as we could certainly use on this. We'll hopefully we'll get some more of that as time goes by. I mean, the more and more studies are being done, but it's a slow process.
Do you consider not consuming carbs to be a stressor for the body, be it a hormetic stressor? I mean, I don't think it's a negative stressor, but is it some sort of stressor? You think from an evolutionary perspective that whenever we did not get carbs, that caused or triggered some sort of stress response? And is this something that over time you get used to and it's not a stressor anymore? Or is it always some sort of, stress response that's going on in?
Yeah. Well, I think, there's obviously serum cortisol levels, which people will point to, and short-term studies do seem to sort of agree that in the short term, you're going to see, elevations, serum hypercortisolemia will occur, but that does seem to attenuate with time. That is something that I think you adapt to it, just like anything else. Right. Obviously, if we look at an evolutionary model on human existence, we spent much of our time in ice ages as Homo sapiens, and then pre that in the other Homo species that have been around, all of which are considered humans technically. So I think there is a level of adaptation to not having carbohydrates for either months at a time or in some cases maybe years at a time. The whole thing about high cortisol is always bad. That there's some nuance. Just like everything else, there's nuance. Right. There's actually indications where higher cortisol can actually be protective and beneficial. So it's not just like, we find nothing's black and white. We don't want our, glucose being as low as possible may not be the ideal situation. Insulin being as low as possible may or may not be the ideal situation. So we have to just sort of, realize that there's a lot of nuance around this. But I do think many people adapt to that because, and as you mentioned, there is eustress, good stress and hormesis and things like that, as opposed to, negative stress or negative chronic stress. And I think with time, with adaptation, and I've looked at, not a lot of people check this, but I've seen quite a few people where they've been carnivore chronically and their cortisol levels are fine. They're not abnormally elevated or decreased. Right. So I think there is a period of adaptation that goes there. And realistically, one of the things is, why do we have this cortisol secretion? Because as our blood glucose often drops, we get into this, but it's pretty clear that prior to using cortisol, we use glucagon. We have this sort of tiered system out there, and glucagon very rapidly and quickly restores blood glucose through hepatic glycogenolysis. That's what it does. When the alpha cells in the pancreas secrete glucagon, tells the liver to break down glycogen to restore the blood glucose. That's before cortisol ever gets involved. And so it's not until your blood glucose gets down into the low 50s that we'll often see a significant cortisol response. And so, I think if you go on any diet, I don't care what it is, you can go vegan diet, you can go Mediterranean, if you do a significant shift from your standard day-to-day food, it's going to be a stress on the body. Yes. Your body will adapt to it. It might take 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that. Typically what I see.
Right. Okay. Now, if people want to learn more, especially if there are athletes out there, they might be interested, okay, how can I, leverage a carnivore diet to improve my performance in the long run, to reduce inflammation, to improve recovery, to reduce aches and pains, especially, in the masters kind of category once you get older and you experience more of that. Is there any way do you have some sort of platform or program where people can reach out and, get some guidance, get some more information, or what would be your recommendation?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've got a couple. We've got Rivero Medical or Rivero.com, where we're just we're a digital healthcare company. We're licensed in all 50 states. We just launched 2 weeks ago, in fact. So we have something like 7,000 people on the waiting list. So that's for healthcare. If you're like somebody that just needs someone to help you with diabetes, metabolic disease, or, probably not your crowd, most likely. But from an athletic standpoint, we have a platform, Carnivore.diet, which, has a lot of resource on just how to implement the diet. I still do one-on-one consultations. You can always book a consultation with me. I usually do that for an hour a day during the week, and so, I mean, there's ways to do that. There's obviously, it's not that complicated, but I mean, I do think there's some nuance around sports that, and we've talked about some of it already, but I mean, how to implement it, when to implement it, how to transition, because it does make sense to transition. Like I said, any athlete that's considering doing this, I would consider doing it in the off season if you have an off season,
right? So
that you can kind of allow your body to adapt to it, and realize that it could take many, many months to adapt to this, and it's something that, I mean, depending on how bad off you are, like if you're an old guy with bum shoulder and you're like, I really want to keep doing snatches and my shoulder's not letting me, you might need to do carnivore for 3 to 6 months before you can sort of get back to that.
All right. Sounds good. Well, I much appreciate your time. A lot of very good information. I think you're active on Twitter and on Instagram, right? Any other platforms that work?
Well, I do have I hate to admit it, but I have a TikTok page, and I have a YouTube channel. So all those things are places where I can go. But hey, I really appreciate it, man. This has been fun chat.
Sounds good. Appreciate it too. Thank you.
All right.